Alright, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast. BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Well, we're still exploring the mystery of the Sodder children today, and this is a case that, once again, I followed back in 2015 rather closely, so, I was a little rusty on my information with the Sodder children. So I've been going through some new things, and I was just listening to a podcast by an individual named PJ, who hosts Simply Strange, and I'll post a link to that in the description. Overall, we're a very well-produced podcast. Now, he spends about the first 20 minutes going through the background information, and then he gets into some more theoretical stuff near the end. So if anyone would like to kind of get to the more theoretical things, if you listen to his podcast, it's probably good to start maybe 25 minutes into it, because like on this channel, I really like to discuss the theories, kind of, gearing these things to people who have some familiarity with the case. And once again, the name of his podcast is Simply Strange, and I'll post a link in the description. Now, let's talk about the mystery of the Sodder children. Well, this is the second part that I'm doing on this case, and I really think it's going to turn into a giant series of uploads. In the first part, we covered all the background, and I really wanted to discuss one very large issue. December 24th, 1945, the house fire decimates the house. It completely caves in. 5 children are missing from Fayetteville, West Virginia, my home state. Now, the big things that I wanted to discuss in this one: what is the likelihood that not 1, not 2, but 5 bodies were reduced 100% to ash? It's like not a single fragment of clothing, not a single bone fragment, 100% reduced to ash. Well, something that PJ mentioned on the Simply Strange podcast was that not only were there oil drums most likely in the basement, as I mentioned in part 1, but George Sodder was in the trucking business, and the trucks were doing what? They were moving coal, so it was very likely that George Sodder had coal in the basement as well. So a lot of flammable things that really could have accelerated the temperature of the house fire. Now, he mentions on the podcast that people have kind of conducted sort of investigations, and they determined that the house fire should never have been hot enough to reduce 5 bodies completely to ash. I mean, I'll tell you that other YouTubers have gone through this, and they sort of showed that a house fire can reach the temperature of a crematorium, and we're talking about somewhere in the vicinity of 1,800 degrees. And once again, I'm still a little rusty on that stuff, but it's like, I mean, that is possible in a house fire to reach the temperature to reduce bone to ash. Bear in mind that the house would have also caved in and continued to smolder. It's like, we're not 100% certain what happened, but what we could say is that a dictionary was found on site that was not burned completely. So many people are like, how was this dictionary able to survive the house fire, but 5 bodies were reduced to ash? Well, I mean, if it is true that the children were killed in the fire, then all 5 children must have been in one part of the house that was in a much hotter temperature zone, and perhaps the dictionary was on the exact opposite side of that temperature zone. And we would really have to need, all 5 children would have to be in the absolute hottest place of the house fire for that to happen, which is possible. And I also need to kind of admit that I need to kind of correct myself from the first part of the podcast, when I was saying that there were no reports of anyone seeing children leaving the house. I believe, though, on Simply Strange, they did say that there was a woman who saw a car on the road that night that had children peering out the window, like a large group of children peering out the window. I mean, were those the Sodder children? We don't know, but there is a report of a woman making that claim. Now, what really is going on here? I would say that one of the reasons why I wanted to do a second part, the biggest reason is what happened in Texas when we had that very famous incident of a woman saying that a man at a bar became very intoxicated and confessed to being Louis Sodder from Fayetteville, West Virginia. Now, it's like, this is one thing that was addressed, and George Sodder actually went to Texas, and he met with not the woman who had made that claim, and he didn't get to see the men that they were talking about, but the police actually were able to get in touch with the two men who the woman had been describing, and they said that they were not the Sodder boys, Maurice and Louis. Now, they mentioned this on the Simply Strange podcast, and it refreshed some of the feelings that I had about this particular incident, because this is something that is not like any of the other allegations. Once again, a man gets intoxicated at a bar and confesses to being Louis Sodder. This is one that is not improbable. It is not ridiculous. It is not based on any assumption. I mean, the only assumption we can make is that the woman who was at the bar fabricated the story and was a total liar, but if we put that off the table, you know what I'm trying to say is, it's not like somebody saw 5 kids at a restaurant the next day. Oh, well, maybe there's a connection there. That's very assumptive. It's not like George saw a girl in a magazine and thought, oh, that girl looks like my daughter. That's very assumptive. No, this is an enormous piece of evidence. Some person in intoxication confessed to being Louis Sodder. That is something that is very definitive. I mean, do I believe that that actually happened? Well, yes. I mean, obviously someone felt that they should reach out. And one of the things that I didn't quite understand during the Simply Strange podcast was, I thought he was saying that George Sodder actually met with the 2 boys. Sorry, they would be men now, and they would have been in their 30s. He actually met with them, and then he determined that they were not his kids, and I was like, I'd never heard that before, and I did, just do a quick Google search, and no, he actually met with the police officers, and I guess I just misheard. He met with the police officers in Texas, and they said that they got in touch with the 2 men that had been described. Well, I mean, I don't really know what that's all about. Doesn't that just sound so bizarre and peculiar? I mean, it's like they got in touch with the 2 men. Well, that means, first of all, George Sodder had no contact with these individuals. So that's kind of supporting the whole theory that these, the Sodder children, if they did survive the fire, they were told never to contact their family again. Well, furthermore, though, there's a very interesting note about the particular individual who would have confessed this to the woman at the bar. Not only did he identify himself as being Louis Sodder, he stated that he had an older brother, being Maurice Sodder, who was also working in Texas. So, don't you see that this is kind of giving some sort of supporting, kind of like a supporting point to that? He's not only identifying himself as being Louis, he's also acknowledging that Maurice Sodder is with him in Texas. So it's just like, this is one of those things that just stands out to me as a much more credible sighting. And I guess I could sort of, 90% I believe it, 10% I don't. Whereas, even the photograph of Louis Sodder that arrived in the mail, that is something that is not definitively Louis, but at the same time, it has his name on it, right? And, it has some information that we talked about in the first part of the podcast, just to kind of reiterate that point. Louis Sodder, I Love Brother Frankie, Lil Boys, LLIL, and, of course, a zip code for Sicily, or 2 possible zip codes. It could be ending in 32 or 35. There is also the slight possibility that that could actually be a handwriting error, and people are mistaking the cursive script, and it's actually saying age 32 or 35. But the way that I interpreted that was, it's saying that this person is Louis Sodder. I Love Brother Frankie means someone that they were staying with for a large portion of their life. Lil Boys could have mean that either that they were taken to Illinois or Italy, Italian boys, something like that, and of course the zip code for Sicily, meaning that they were taken to Italy for a period of time. And a lot of people are attributing that to the Italian mafia sighting. I just find it so perplexing that if 5 children did die in this house fire and they were reduced to ash, I mean, I think that it's a completely plausible that that could have actually happened based on the conditions that we talked about. Not the house caves in and the fires continue to smolder. There's coal in the basement, possibly oil drums, accelerates the blaze, and then it could have become much hotter than a normal house fire. Totally possible. But at the same time, George Sodder was involved with making those outspoken comments about Benito Mussolini. He offended a lot of people. He offended the life insurance salesman. And also, like, on the Simply Strange podcast, he was kind of like, well, it's very surprising that the Italian mafia is in West Virginia. As I am from West Virginia, and I don't think that's so surprising based on the Italian wave of immigration that we had around that time. And, you can go to a mountain town in West Virginia that looks like it's out of the sticks, but they will just have, brilliant Italian pizzeria that will, just have a bunch of historical things on the wall, and they kind of people will talk to you about that. I've known people who grew up that way from the wave of Italian migration. We had many Italian immigrants coming to the western part of my state, and that's one of the things that is very well preserved, and people kind of speak very highly of it. So I don't think that there's anything abnormal at all about the Italian mafia being involved in West Virginia in that particular time period. I think that's totally normal. But, furthermore, the sightings that people are describing about, say, for example, 2 days after the fire, that they do see some people talking in Italian at a restaurant, and they're just being very nervous, and this was in Charleston, West Virginia, I believe, or at the very least outside of Fayetteville, closer to Charleston, somewhere in between those two. But once again, that's not the craziest thing in the world. I mean, it is evidence, not proof, but evidence. I mean, at the same time, though, I mean, there are a lot of Italian-American families in the area. Once again, if we have this big Italian community, if the Italian community is so big that the mafia is involved, well, there are going to be a lot of Italian-American families. I mean, I think it could be relevant, but one of the things we should also recognize is just, it's very assumptive. It's very assumptive to say that anything like that is 100% connected. We do know that there is a photograph that has Louis Sodder's name on it. We do know that a woman contacted George Sodder and said that some guy confessed to being Louis Sodder at a bar. Furthermore, this would really sort of kind of support the fact that the children survived the fire. But I have a giant question that I just simply can't understand. Why take the children away from George Sodder? I mean, I understand that they would want to be revengeful. I understand that they would want to kind of put him through misery and agony, but I mean, like, what was their ambition with that? I mean, I think even on the Wikipedia page it says that the family thought that they wanted to extract money from them later on, but as far as we know, that didn't happen. What was the ambition to take away the children, not asking for any ransom, not asking for any demands, not even acknowledging that the children were still alive? So what really is the ambition for that? I mean, you take somebody's children away, like, I don't know. That is one thing that I flat out do not have an answer for, unless it's just there is some sort of motive that went on that we don't really know about. I mean, that's just something that isn't very clear. What would be the ambition to just take 5 children away from their parents? But no ransom money. I mean, did they just send them away to be... Is this just an act of cruelty against the Sodder family? Perhaps. I don't know, a lot of people really didn't like George Sodder. That's what I can gather from all the sort of interpretations that are going on. But I would really like to focus, though, on that event in Texas. That is not, something that is outrageous. I mean, okay, George Sodder looks at a person in a magazine and he thinks that that girl has a resemblance to his daughter. That's a little bit outrageous. I mean, just from people who interpret, true crime clues like we do, I don't really find that to be super convincing that that was definitively his daughter. But when someone, gets intoxicated, and what is the saying? The truth comes out when you're drunk. And before you think that that could be just a total hoax, the event in Texas he also identified Maurice Sodder as being present, so you see how that's kind of like starts to sound a little bit more real. And then we really did get sort of a clarification that George Sodder never saw either one of these men, and the police were the only ones that acted as the intermediary. The intermediary between George and these two men, if they actually did follow through with that. I mean, I don't necessarily know. That's kind of a very, very bizarre statement, and to be honest, it doesn't sound very genuine. That George Sodder went to Texas, he got in touch with the police, and the police said, yeah, we found these two guys that were identified at a bar, and they say that they're not your children. Well, for starters, George never met with the woman at the bar who identified Louis, and the second thing to say is that George did not get to see the boys. The third thing to say is these two guys were probably not identifying. They were probably not identifying themselves as the Sodder boys, Louis and Maurice, because they probably had strict orders not to if they were still alive. Because that's the big thing that's associated with any sort of Italian mafia theory. That is something that is associated with any sort of theory that the children are still alive, that someone must have told them, do not talk to your family again or they will be harmed. That isn't even coming from me. That's the Sodder family's own theory. And I sort of had the exact same feeling when we heard any of these things go, when we heard of anything of that nature, just like the only reason that they wouldn't reach out to their family is if they were under strict orders not to. I mean, unless there's some sort of, conditioning and brainwashing going on. But I'm not going down that road, because once again, that becomes too assumptive. What's not assumptive is some woman is sitting in a bar talking to an intoxicated guy who said, hey, by the way, my name is Louis Sodder, and I have a brother named Maurice. I mean, unless that guy is just some type of true crime junkie of the 1960s who just had a fascination with the case and just sort of muttered out nonsense. What I'm trying to say is, overall, I can say I somewhat believe that sighting could be credible. I'm not certain, because I think it's totally possible that the 5 children did die in the house fire. I'm very divided on this, and I wish I could just tell you guys, like, this is my absolute largest theory that I want to go with, like gung-ho, but I can't say that with this case. Now, there's another thing to mention. We didn't get to talk about this on the first part, but there is a psychic named Michael Wenger, but he's a very interesting guy. He does true crime cases. I think I got his name right, Michael Wenger. He's from Norway, and he has covered a variety of true crime cases on his YouTube channel, but he doesn't actually talk about anything associated with psychic powers. Everything he does in his YouTube work is all just kind of, giving commentary on the cases. But one of the things that he did was he used the app called Face Shine, and he put the Face Shine app comparing 2 photos, one of Louis Sodder and one of the person who was in the Louis Sodder photograph, age 31 or 32. He compared the 2 photos using a facial recognition app, and they have an over 80% match. There's an over 80% probability that Louis Sodder was the person in the photo, and he used the app on photos of his own children compared to himself, and the match was only in the 30s. Like, there's only a 30% chance that these 2 people are the same. This app is called Face Shine, one more time. And, that really goes to show that there is a very high likelihood that the person in that photograph was Louis Sodder. And what do we really want to make of that? Well, I mean, that could really be something like 5 children were taken away from their families, and they were, maybe the people who took them away wanted to extract money from the Sodders at a later date, but then the authorities got involved, and there was too much publicity around the events, and they just thought that, oh, we're going to get in trouble if we do that, so they didn't want to draw attention to themselves. I don't know. I can't even endorse anything like that. I'm just kind of saying things off the cuff, but what we could say is that if the 5 children were taken away, they could have been brought to Italy for a time, I mean, we're probably talking about at least 10 years. Then they come back to America, and then they just carry on with their normal lives using different names. That line, "I love brother Frankie," what that really tells me is that there was some guy named Frankie that was maybe Francesco that was taking care of them, that he became kind of the new guardian for the Sodder family. Just speculating. Lil Boys, like, there's a very interesting thing about that one on the Louis Sodder photograph. It's written Lilbois. This was written with handwriting, mind you. And if you just remember that your pen or your pencil can scratch the paper and not leave a complete line, I also thought that that might actually be 4 boys, like someone's writing out 4 tally marks, 1, 2, 3, 4. Or then there was just a little bit of a kind of handwriting error, or that the pen, got a little rough with the ink or something, or the pencil, whatever it was. It was written by hand, we know that. So what I could say about that is there's a possibility that that could just say 4 boys, meaning that Maurice and Louis, and then we would have Frankie, Francesco, and maybe somebody else, that could actually be 4 boys, like these 4 boys are together in America. Because remember, Louis, if this sighting of Louis Sodder in Texas is genuine, he only identified Maurice. He didn't say, I will be 3 other sisters with me. No, he said nothing about them. He said that his brother was there in Texas. So there is the very large possibility that that could just be 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Once again, that's a bit of a stretch. It could also be a place name. I really think it might actually be a place name that it could be something more like either Illinois or Italy. We do have that number that begins with the letter A. It could be the zip code for a place in Sicily. That could very well be someone trying to communicate that this is Louis Sodder in the photograph. He was being cared for by somebody named Frankie, and he was taken to Italy, and that this was the place where they were taken. I don't know, something's really bothering me about that the word Lil is spelled L-L-I-L, and some people think that it's I-L-I-L. Once again, this was a handwriting thing. I'm not 100% certain, but what I can say is that I find it very interesting that that those 4 letters are put together, L-L-I-L. I don't know, I really thought that might actually contain a much larger meaning. And like, I don't know, something is just standing out to me about that. But just to recap, I think that the sighting of Louis Sodder in Texas sounds very genuine. The